These are what I call worry mugs, and I make them when I'm feeling a little bit anxious. Unlike most of my work, they're not thrown on the wheel, but are instead hand-built from pinch pots and slabs. They're not meant to be perfectly even or have a flat rim or even sit completely flat. They have a lot of movement in the walls and lots of little textures you can run your fingers over. In this video, I'm going to show you my process, walking you through from start to finish how I make, glaze, and fire these little adorable pots. I start by rolling out some clay. Sometimes I will use a slab roller, or sometimes I'll roll them out by hand with a rolling pin. But today I decided to do a combination of rolling pin and this lovely method of slamming your slab of clay across a table in various directions from one direction mostly. Like I'm picking my clay up from one edge and slapping it down against the table. This actually does make your clay thin out and get wider all the way around. Now, you wouldn't want to do this for a pot you wanted perfectly even walls, but since these worry mugs are meant to have a little bit of movement, I'm not too worried about my clay being perfectly consistent all the way through. It's okay if there's a teeny tiny difference in one little bit of the slab versus another, so I'm not being particularly careful rolling out my slabs here. Another thing that can happen when using this method is warping. So if you care a lot about having the opening of your pot be very round, wouldn't want to use this method. I am likely to see a little bit of warping with this clay, but since my goal is a cup that isn't necessarily straight-sided, it's a little looser, it has a lot of texture, I'm not worrying about that too much. I'm rolling out significantly more clay than I need for one, as I plan to make a batch of about 12 of these, so actually off camera I roll out even more slabs so I have a wide variety to choose from. After rolling out my slabs, I'm going to set them aside so they can dry for a little while. I'm aiming for my clay to be at an early leather hard stage. That means that the clay will be stiff enough to hold itself up and not collapse as I'm attaching pieces, but still be soft enough that I can bend it without it cracking, ripping, or breaking. That also means that the pieces will be soft enough that I can still alter their thickness a little bit. As I'm going to be layering these slabs of clay, I don't want any part to get too thick, so I'll still be able to roll them a little bit thinner and make attachments very easily. After I'm done rolling my slab, I'll move on to putting together other parts of the clay. I had started this before I rolled my slab. You can see next to me I have a bunch of little balls of clay. I didn't weigh those, I just kind of rolled out an amount that felt fairly good. I'm going to end up with mugs that are fairly small, so I'm not trying to aim for a giant ball of clay, but these are going to function as the bottom base part of the mug. So I prepped those first to let them sit so they would stiffen a little bit, and then moved into working on the little tripod feet. To do these, I'm just grabbing a little bit of clay and making sure I have 3 balls of clay that are vaguely the same size. I don't want one to be drastically bigger or drastically smaller than the other, so I prep 3 little balls of clay, and then I'm going to shape them into a little tiny, basically cone shape, with one end thicker and one end thinner. When I'm hand building, I find it really helpful to work in series, so I will prep multiple things and then do the next step rather than doing them one at a time. This allows me to be a little bit more efficient because while hand building is very satisfying, it's very slow, especially when you're used to throwing on the wheel. So I first start by prepping most of these little balls and then work on shaping them. I'm also aiming to have all of my pieces be at about the same stage of leather hard when it comes time to put them all together. I want these little feet to be just a little bit stiffer than everything else though, because they need to be able to hold the mug up. And even though I'm not going to set the mugs on their feet for the time being once I first put them together, having these be slightly stiffer does allow them to help hold their shape a little bit better. I prep 3 little feet per mug that I'm intending to make, and that takes me a little while, so we're going to jump to the part where I start working on the base of the mug. This is one of my favorite parts of the entire process because we're going to make a little pinch pot. I'm just going to take the ball of clay that I had prepped, and using my thumbs, I'm going to make a little divot into the center of it, and then carefully using my thumb and fingers, pinch along the sides of the clay, making a little half bowl shape. I'm not trying to make this super thin with the first pass. I want to thin them out more as I go to keep them even, so I pinch around, leaving it a little bit thicker, and then I go back in and pinch around again until I reach my desired thinness. Sometimes I'll even pinch them once, set them aside so they can stiffen a little, and then go back in and pinch around again to get the desired shape. I'm aiming for something fairly low and wide, and once I'm done with one, I make a bunch more and set those aside as well. Next, it's time to prep some clay for handles, and I just grab some clay from my block and roll little logs of clay. These handles are going to be pinched, so I don't need a lot of clay, but I want to make sure they're all fairly even from start to finish, and I don't have any lumps in there. I didn't wedge this, I just pulled it straight off of the block and prepped as many as I need for all of my mugs. I'll also let those set up for just a little while so they're a little bit stiffer. Fresh off the block is sometimes a little too soft for pinching handles. It can make them a little floppy and they don't hold their shape particularly well, so letting them sit can be helpful. To make the handles, I'm just going to take my little carrot of clay and using my thumb and index finger on both hands, I'm going to just pinch down the length of the little carrot of clay. This often leads to having a little tiny ridge in the center of the handle that I find very uncomfortable, so I'll run my finger right back down the center, pinching the length of the handle to get rid of that little ridge, and then I'll just go back in and continue pinching down the length of the handle to thin it and flatten it back and forth between the two different hand positions until the handle reaches the desired length, thickness, and kind of shape. I'm aiming for not as round of a shape as I often go for with my pulled handles. I want them to have a little bit more of an angle. I also don't mind if the edges are a little irregular, a little bit uneven. I know sometimes you want a really flat, perfect handle. Pinched handles aren't really the way to do that. You're always going to be able to see a little bit of texture from your fingers, and I think that's part of what makes them so comfortable, as long as you watch that ridge right down the center. I go through and make all of the handles I'm intending to make for all of the different mugs and then set them aside to dry. As you can see when I pick this handle up, it's a little bit floppy, and if I try to attach it now, it won't hold its shape well, so I want them just a little bit stiffer. After the bottoms of the mugs have set up some, I like to take a rib and go in and smooth out the bottom inside. While I like having the texture on the outside, I want the inside to be as smooth as possible, so if you're stirring something into a drink or cleaning, you don't cut your sponge or have a little bump that's a little difficult to clean. So I use my rib to smooth out the bottom inside and kind of adjust the rims of each of the little bottoms of these mugs. So much of clay is just teeny tiny fiddly details, and spending that extra time on those details is what makes a pot feel really nice. I'm now going to assemble all of the pieces that I made and make them into one of the worry mugs. I start by taking a slab and rolling it just a tiny bit thinner. It was a little bit thicker than I wanted, and I'm beveling both edges of the mug. I want the lip to have a slight angle because I find that the most comfortable to drink from, and I want the attachment edge to not be too thick, because if they're too thick, the mug will feel really bulky right where I stick them together. I'll now take my slab of clay and kind of test coil it together to see where my pot is going to overlap, how it's going to overlap, where the lip is going to set, and how wide it needs to be to fit the little base that I constructed. This part of the process is very fiddly. I'm going to go back and forth between measuring and making little cuts and making adjustments and thinning little pieces of the clay before test fitting it again, and then maybe rolling it a little thinner or cutting off more of the lip. I want to be careful to get this all right on this flat slab because it's much more difficult to alter it once it is already attached to the base. You may also have noticed that as I'm working with this slab of clay, it's softened a lot. It's no longer holding itself up as well, and that happens when you roll a slab a lot that is a little bit on the softer end. I could have set it aside and let it set up a little bit more before continuing, but it didn't matter. I just continued to work thinning and cutting and making sure the lip is sitting the way I want, which is really important, making sure the base is going to attach the way I want, getting that angle just right. My goal is to have these slightly wider at the base and narrower towards the lip because I find it more comfortable to hold. So I'm trying to get that overlap just right to have the lip be slightly narrowed and the base be slightly wider. These little moments where I'm slowing down and handling the clay and making these decisions are part of why switching from throwing to hand building can be so satisfying for me. I love the opportunity I get to slow down when making these worry mugs, and since I often make them when I'm feeling anxious, that opportunity to slow down, be in the moment, make slower decisions, and just get clay in between my fingers is part of why I enjoy making them so much. As someone who's struggled with anxiety my whole life, finding ways to slow down and move outside of the need to move quickly and make decisions fast is something I value tremendously. So it's very satisfying to be able to make these little worry mugs, even if they're not as popular as some of my other mugs. That option to slow down, make decisions, play with my clay a little bit more, so worth it. I'm now ready to attach my pieces together, so I'm going to score and slip very thoroughly the little rim of the pinch pot and the slab of clay right where I want it to attach, as well as any spots where the clay is going to overlap itself. So I'm using a scoring tool, I'm scratching very thoroughly, and then I'm going to add some fairly thick slip all the way around as I slowly attach these pieces together. Getting a really strong bond in between two pieces that you're attaching is really important for functionality. And since I want those bonds to be really strong, I use a little bit of extra slip and make sure I've scored fairly deeply into my clay. The extra slip allows me to blend my pieces together without using a bunch of extra water, and the extra slip will also sink into the texture I've created by scoring. And that leads to the strongest bond possible. So I take my time making sure all of these pieces are thoroughly scored and slipped, and then I blend them together. While I'm reaching my hand down into this mug, I'm trying to be careful not to stretch the lip of the pot out too much, so I often blend a little bit as I go. So I'll attach a tiny piece, blend it down, attach a little bit more, blend a little bit more, pinching and smoothing, and being careful not to stretch the lip too much. My clay is fairly soft, and if I was working with it any stiffer, it might actually rip rather than stretch. So I'm trying to work that balance between the clay being stiff enough to hold up well and soft enough to bend rather than rip or crack. It's very important that I also score and slip the attachment where those two slabs overlap. Otherwise, those aren't going to hold up very well either, and I typically intend to place my handle right over that seam since it's more uncomfortable to drink from anyway, and you typically don't drink from a mug right where the handle attaches, so I want to make sure it can support the weight of a handle without cracking. So right now I have my hand on the inside of the mug at the bottom and my hand on the outside around the base, and I'm carefully pushing from the inside and the outside to kind of press those pieces together and then going through and smoothing. This is another one of those little fiddly steps that takes forever, but I want to make sure I do it well. I'll even sometimes take little extra tools. These are little rubber tipped tools that I can go in and smooth out that joint even more. I really don't want any sharp edges on the inside of the mug, but I'm okay with leaving texture on the outside where those mug bottoms and the slab attach. I think it's kind of cute and it gives the glaze a spot to pool. I also wouldn't want to do this with my clay any softer, especially for the bottom, than this, because then I wouldn't be able to rest it on the table as I work. It would be too soft and it would indent, and I would no longer have a round bottom on the bottom of this mug. So I'm going to attach this piece and then set it aside so it can stiffen a little bit more, and we'll come back to it once it's a little bit drier. In this case, it meant that I was going to come back to it the next day, so I took all of the pieces I had constructed and put them into tote boxes with lids so that I could let them set overnight before coming back the next day to finish making and attaching my mugs. I also thought it would be nice for you to see me making these from another angle, so here we are making a similar mug but not the same from a different angle on a later day. So I'm now rolling this slab out and I'm trying to get it to curve just a little bit. That curve makes it a little bit easier for it to sit inside the lip of the little pinch pot that I made while still having a fairly even lip. And I'm going to cut these at a fairly steep angle on both sides so that the bevel sits nicely. Same as with the other mug, I'm also going to test fit it and roll the edges to make sure that they are nice and tapered so that the drinking spot is thin. I really like a thin lip on a mug. I find it more comfortable to drink from rather than one that's really round, but as with all things in pottery, there are so many parts of it that are subjective. So if you like a thicker rim, that's great. I just happen to like these thin, sharp lips. I think they fit into the corners of my mouth really nice and dribble less while I'm drinking. The beauty of these worry mugs is that no two is exactly the same, and I think that's part of why I love them so much. It gives me the opportunity to play with the form. When I'm making other mugs, particularly mugs that I'm throwing, I often want them to be close, never identical unless I'm making a set for someone, and that's not just a cop-out. I don't intend my pieces to be mass manufactured. I intend them to feel like someone made them. I can make mugs identical, although not as well at hand building as I can when I'm throwing, but they lose a little bit of that handmade soul for me. So while I often make mug blanks that are very similar, I'm never aiming for exact perfection. I would rather have you look at my mugs and see that they're similar, but not all identical. And that carries really lovely over into the worry mugs. It gives me a lot of options for playing with shape and the way I stick these patches together. Sometimes I just roll a slab and attach those. Sometimes I take all the leftover pieces of a slab and kind of hodgepodge them together to make the walls for a mug. And that can feel very different, but every single time they still feel like a playful mug, one that is dancing just a little bit, one that you can see was constructed through little parts, and being able to see that construction is something that I love in a handmade mug. So after making all of the adjustments to the slab that I'd like, I'm going to smooth over it with my finger. I try not to leave any distinct textures from my rolling pins or my slabs, or definitely no canvas. I want them to be smooth, or if there is any texture, the texture comes directly from my fingers. So I'll pinch through them a little bit more, or sometimes even from the way the slab bends. I don't see little tiny cracks in these necessarily as something bad, as long as they don't run all the way through and aren't at the lip. So after test fitting, I'll make sure that those pots overlap the way I want, score and slip and attach just the same as the other mug. Something that's really noticeable about this time is that my slabs and the bottoms of my pots are slightly stiffer, which allows for a slightly easier time connecting all of the pieces. When they're a little softer, it's a little more unwieldy, and I have to be really careful about how I handle the slab to not end up with really distinct dents or textures. Now, this is still a soft leather hard. It's still very flexible, but it holds its shape just a tiny bit better, which makes this whole process just a little easier. I'm able to combine my pieces much faster. So the beauty of working like this and having tote boxes is that I can let them sit covered and wrapped and not have them dry out too much. I find just covering them with a loose sheet of plastic is not enough, and oftentimes they will be a little bit too dry if I do that, but using little totes, I'm able to control the moisture of my pottery much better. I find that I don't need to add plaster to the bottoms of my damp boxes. Some potters really like to do that, especially if they live in a drier climate, but I live in the Pacific Northwest, so it's fairly damp here year-round, and I'm able to just stick them straight in a box and put a lid on it, and they maintain their moisture like that for a good number of weeks before they are too dry for me to be able to do anything with them. I also wanted to show you these parts of the process not sped up at all. I thought about speeding up this video because I know that watching someone do teeny tiny details can be a little bit boring, but I find it important to show you all of the little steps that go into making something. So often we want to rush through our making process, or because little parts of our process get not shown on the internet, we think it's going to be faster than it will. I personally always underestimate how long it's going to take me to hand build something, and so I thought I would be able to knock out all 12 of these mugs very quickly, and instead it took me the better part of 2 days just to make these 12 mugs. And if I were to just speed up or not show you all the little parts, you would miss how right here I noticed that the lip isn't sitting quite the way I want. And so I take my X-Acto knife and cut a little tiny dart out of the pot before carefully scoring and slipping that dart closer together to make the lip of the pot slightly more narrow. That's the other fun part about these worry mugs, is that if there's a part not sitting quite the way I want, I can dart it, which is just to take a little bit of clay away and then push those pieces back together. And I think that makes them even more fun. I find personally making these to feel a lot like constructing a garment while sewing. There's lots of little parts to fold and tuck and cut away and attach, and I enjoy that. I like sewing as well. I'm not as good at it as I am at making pots, but I find it satisfying to be able to make a shape feel in my hands the way I want it to, and darting is a really lovely way to do that. Since this mug is slightly stiffer than the first one we put together, I'm able to do some cleanup steps now that had to wait on the other pot. So I start by making sure the inside is perfectly smooth. I always go back in after the initial attachment and really smooth out and run my finger down around where the slab part attaches to the base, smoothing that out and making sure it attaches really nicely. I'm also pushing out lightly there to help make that mug a little bit wider at the bottom to allow it to taper up more towards the top. Because that attachment is still fairly fresh, I'm able to push it out a little bit more without causing any ripping, but still getting a little bit more volume down there, which makes these mugs hold just a teeny tiny bit more. I'm also making sure there are no sharp corners and that there's no big step there, that once this mug is completely dry and I'm ready to glaze it, you're going to be able to feel it smoothly on the inside. Having a smooth inside makes them easier to clean later, even if they're a little bit narrow at the top. Now that I've finished reaching inside the mug, I'll also make sure the lip is sitting exactly the way I want, so I'll smooth my finger from the inside, pressing out to give it a little bit of a flare and make sure that lip is pointed but still rounded at the top so that it's not too sharp. And I'll also take this opportunity to clean up any slip around the outside that has kind of squished out. So I'm going to take a little rubber finger tool and just run it along the bottom of the pinch pot and the top part where the mug attaches to clean up any extra slip and add a little catch point there. I like putting this in because it allows me to use glazes that run a little bit more and will settle into that spot and get a little bit more depth, which I think is beautiful. And it also helps me control any sharp spots. I don't want anything sharp. I do want texture, but no sharp spots. So making sure I've removed anything that's sharp and cleaned up all of the spots I'd like, I'm then going to set this mug aside and attach all of the other slabs to the bases before coming back to attach the handles. I want these to be just a little bit stiffer so the handle doesn't deform the lip of the pot, since attaching and working on these mugs does soften the slab just a little bit. So I spent some time assembling the other mugs off camera, and now that they've stiffened some, it's time to add our handles back on. So I've just grabbed a random mug. It's slightly different from the other ones you've seen, but it doesn't matter, and a handle that we can attach to it. The handle is significantly stiffer than it was before, which is great. I'm able to handle a little bit more without it flopping around, but it is still leather hard. It is not so dry that any part of it is white, and I can still flex it and bend it as much as I need to. I'm going to test fit this handle by just carefully holding it up next to the mug and seeing how I like it. I want to see where I need to make any cuts to the handle, where I want it to sit, and generally when I make these, I have the handle attached just slightly below the lip so it can come up and then back down, and then attach the base right about where the two parts of the mug meet, right where the pinch pot and the slab meet. I'll then cut off any extra clay from the bottom, carefully flatten that spot a little bit. I kind of like them to be slightly thicker at the bottom and slightly thicker at the top and thin in the middle, and then carefully line that up again, once again scoring and slipping to make all of my attachments. It's really, really important that all of your attachments are scored and slipped, especially since these are even later leather hard than we were making our attachments before. So after lining up my handle, I'll just kind of carefully mark them out so I know where to make my marks for scoring, and then score very thoroughly, scratching deeply with my scoring tool on both the handle and the mug body. When I go to attach my handle, I'm going to make sure I'm holding the inside of the mug and supporting it, not just pressing my handle onto the mug. Otherwise, I'm going to crack the lip of this pot. It is now dry enough that rather than bending, if I squeeze it, it will crack. So I want to be very careful. I'm going to press fairly firmly, giving it a little wiggle to push that handle into the pot, both at the top and at the bottom right where they attach. Sometimes I smooth these parts out really thoroughly so that you can't see where the mug starts and the handle starts. This time, I think I left them a little bit less blended out so you can see the attachment point, but no matter what, I'm being very careful to push that handle into the mug very firmly so it doesn't fall off. I'll also clean up any extra slip using my little rubber finger tools to smooth out those edges and define them a little so you can see them. I really like to spend my time here because if a mug does not have a comfortable handle, I will never reach for it. Part of the most important part of interacting with a mug is its handle and its lip, so I really want to make sure those two spots are really comfortable and have no problem. So I spend a lot of time fussing with my handles, getting them just right, getting the curve to feel right, and it's always a little bit of a guess because you can't actually hold your pot by the handle until it's been through the first firing, otherwise it might just kind of fall apart. In the process of attaching this handle, I do end up kind of causing a little split in between two of my slabs. And on most other projects, this would mean that this pot was going to be kind of ruined. But with a worry mug, I can apply a little bandage to it, and I honestly think they look kind of cute. So it's kind of fun when this happens and I'm able to add a little bit more thickness to this spot. If it had happened anywhere except where it happened, I would need to be careful to thin that spot out enough, but it's kind of in a spot where your mouth isn't going to interact, so it's less important that I thin that spot anymore. To fix it, I'm just going to take a tiny slab of clay and roll it really thin. I want it to act just like a little bandage over the top layer. And then I'm going to scratch and score the surface of the mug, but not the little piece I'm attaching, and then dip it in some water and apply it directly to that scored place. Now, in a lot of clays, this may cause this piece to crack off. My clay really doesn't mind as long as there's enough moisture in between your scoring. It doesn't seem to matter too much. So I'm able to just apply it like a little bandage and then move on, and that lip will be perfectly fine and still super cute after firing. It's now time to attach the little tripod feet to the bottoms of these mugs. Sometimes I do this before I put the handle on, sometimes I do it after. It doesn't really matter, but what is essential is that one of the feet lines up with the handle. Otherwise, the handle can make these mugs fall over. With the foot placed in that particular spot, they're nice and stable. The same process we've been using the whole time, I'm going to score and slip these little feet in place. This time, I score and slip this one first before figuring out where I want to place the other two. I'm aiming to have them be in about thirds around the pot, but it doesn't need to be perfect. I just want it to support itself. So I carefully figure out where I'm going to place them, score and slip, and attach those as well. Now this mug has stiffened a good bit, otherwise I would want to really put my hand inside the mug before pressing on, but I'm kind of mostly just resting them there lightly before I'm going to go in and really smooth them out and make sure they're attached to the base. This is kind of more preliminary and not the final step of this process. I'm also going to carefully and quickly check at this point that the mug sits about the way I want it to. Sometimes I can put the feet on and they will be too angled, and if they're too angled, the mug will really look like it's going to tip over, which can look really fun but isn't as functional. And anytime I'm making something, I'm playing with that balance of form and function. Pottery should have both. You should have pots that look nice and feel good and also kind of feel fun. I don't think pottery is always super serious. I love making things that have a little bit of movement, have a little bit of dance, or make somebody giggle. So these worry mugs, I just make them with what feels right. But I do want the lips to sit so that they're not too tipped, so that you can fill them up with at least a reasonable amount of coffee or tea. To help finish blending the little feet into the body of the mug, I'm using one of my little rubber tipped tools to push the clay down and into the base. I'll then go over this with my sponge and really smooth them out, but I find this helps them be a little bit smoother and less likely to crack over time as they dry. Speaking of drying, after making all of these attachments, these mugs are basically done, so I'm going to set them aside and cover them to let them dry for about 24 hours or so before coming back and removing the covering to let them dry the rest of the way. Once they're bone dry, I'm then going to take my sponge and smooth over the lip and the handle to make sure there's no rough spots for your fingers to catch on. I find it much easier to smooth with the clay being all the way dry. And then they'll get bisqued, which is the first part of the firing process. That's going to take them from being clay that can be dissolved into being something that is ceramic that won't dissolve in water, which makes the glazing process much, much easier. I didn't manage to take any video of my bisque process, but I loaded my kiln, it fired for about 12 hours, cooled off, and then I unloaded it. And now it's time to do some final decorating steps. These were all of the pots that I had in my bisque, so here's a chance for you to look at them. I think it's really fun. And this is how I film my videos. You can see this funny tripod with a brick on one end. My next step is finishing any decorating, and for these worry mugs, that just means signing the bottoms of my pots with my shop signature, which says this with an exclamation point at the end. I can then move on to glazing my pots, and the first step of that is mixing my glaze together very well. Glaze is just a suspension of all of your glaze ingredients, which form glass once fired, into some water. The water is just there to help you apply your glaze to your piece, so you need to mix it really thoroughly so that that suspension is even from top to bottom in the bucket. I can then dip my pieces into the bucket of glaze to apply the first coat of glaze. I'm going to do this through something called pop glazing. I'm going to hold the mug by the little tripod foot and carefully lower it into the bucket, keeping the lip level. Without letting the lip leave the surface of the glaze, I'm then going to sharply pull upwards or maybe even plunge up and down, but not let the lip of the pot leave the surface of the glaze. And that will allow that little air bubble that was in there to exit the pot and the glaze to fill the entire inside of the pot. This leaves you with an incredibly even coat of glaze, inside and out, all at once very quickly, and it is my favorite way to glaze things. It's very, very fast, which allows me to glaze a lot of pieces very quickly, and it's very efficient. I'm still practicing getting it sharper so that it's even cleaner, because while I'm very good at it, I'm also still always working on improving my techniques so that I get less splash, because you can do this with a little bit less splash than I get, but it's still very effective, and I'm always pleased when I get to do it. Something that surprises a lot of people is that glaze dries very quickly, so within about 15 seconds of dunking this glaze, it is completely dry and I can handle it and set it down, which is great because these tripod feet are kind of hard to push onto the table. It's much easier to wait for the glaze to be dry before lifting it out of my hand and setting it on the table. Those little fingerprints where I was holding onto the mug, I'm going to clean those up by adding a little bit more of that white glaze right there, but still removing all of the glaze from the bottoms of the foot, since glaze can't be on the very base of a pot or it will stick when you fire it. I'm then going to let these mugs sit and dry so that as much of that water can evaporate before I add any other coats of glaze, because I think it would be boring if these were just white. And if I apply 2 coats of glaze too close together, the second coat may not stick or may be very thin, and I want a thicker coat of glaze. So the next day I come back with a different glaze that I've mixed up, and here's our pot ready to go, and it's time to do some fun stuff. I start by taking a pitcher and putting just a little bit of glaze in it that I can pour onto the inside of this mug. I'm not trying to get a whole other coat of glaze in here, just a little bit that I then swirl around and pour out and try to just get a fun little splash of color on the inside. I'm then going to take a brush and carefully load it up with some glaze and splash it across the surface of the pot. This is so fun. If you've never done this before, it's really freeing. I'm almost just slapping the pot with the end of the brush, which is super satisfying. Sometimes I'll also kind of dribble a little bit of glaze over the top, but I'm aiming for some loose, fun marks here, and for that glaze to have some interaction with the surface. Glazes don't just sit on top of each other when you apply them. They're glass. They melt together and have different effects depending on what colors you've added. So it's really fun to see what those effects are. Even more fun, the order you add glaze on actually matters a lot. So if I had put the color and then the white on top, I would have a different result than putting color on top of the white. So I prefer the way this looks when I color them with white first and then drip or splash other colors on top of it. It allows a really bright splash, and it's really freeing for someone who works like me, someone who works on very tight controlled pots, to make looser, more organic, more playful pots once in a while. And if you've never done it, I think you should try. Especially this part, the splashing of glaze. We often think about glazing as something you have to do that's not fun, and I don't love glazing either, but I had so much fun doing this process. It was super messy, but it was super delightful and fun, and I really enjoyed it. I did make sure that all of the bottoms of these pots were completely clean before they went in the kiln with a sponge, just like this. If you've applied lots of layers of glaze, you will have to be careful. It could run really badly, and I don't want that. Thankfully, I know the way these glazes interact, so I removed just enough from those spots before they get loaded into the kiln. I did this with more than one glaze, so you're going to see some more footage of me doing that, but we're going to move on to talking about kilns and loading and firing. I fire all of my pieces to cone 10 in reduction in a gas kiln that my husband and I built for Radius Art Studio in Portland, Oregon. That kiln's name is Shirley, and if you are in Portland, Oregon, and you'd like to fire with us, you are able to. We do drop off firings for cone 10 reduction. So when I'm firing this kiln, I'm not only loading my own work, I'm loading a bunch of work from students and community members, and I think that is just so lovely. That reduction also gives me the opportunity to work with glazes that are a little bit more volatile, that might change a good bit more than glazes do at cone 6 in reduction. So some of these glazes I've been splashing have high amounts of copper in them, which will give them a pink or green appearance, which is really fun. The glaze I'm splashing right now is an iron colored celadon, which will be blue. Once everything is ready, we take everything outside, and here's a big bunch of the work that we loaded into Shirley in some photos, and we get started loading our pieces. We want to fit as much of them as we can in there, and so here is what the stack looks like after we're done loading. We fit most of this in here, which was super awesome. Here is what our kiln load looked like, and I just love getting to see all of these pieces all together. This is the most nerve-wracking part of the process. The kiln is loaded, we're about to brick the door up and light it off. We fire for about 12 hours, having to sit there with the kiln the entire time, making adjustments because Shirley is a manual kiln, and then it cools for a couple of days before we take the door down. And I'm sorry, I only took video in this vertical format, but unbricking the door is always so exciting. You never know whether all of your work came out or not, especially when you're firing with the community. So you can see us all unloading, taking the door down together, putting those bricks away so that we can see what happened inside the kiln. Here is what everything looked like after the firing, that moment where you get to see how well the kiln reduced and how the pieces came out. And this was such a satisfying firing. Everything came out beautifully. You can see how much everything shrinks. It does shrink a good bit. All those pieces were much closer together when the kiln was originally turned on. But overall, this was a very satisfying firing, one of our most even, and everyone was really pleased. So that's super exciting. After we unload, we take our pieces home, and I typically sit with them for a couple of days before coming back to look at them. And here is what they look like all the way fired. I love how much these surfaces come alive with some of these glazes, these layered glazes. You can see this one had a white base and then had that glaze splashed over the top. This is a different glaze splashed over the inside, but it's pink and green, which is so exciting. So wonderful to see so many beautiful colors come out of this firing. There were also other mugs that I didn't show the process of because I made a lot of these worry mugs, but I wanted to still be able to show you them after. This one just got dipped in a simple solid celadon, so it's a little bit bluer in person than it looks right now. The sun was really strong, but I love how simple this one is. I think it came out beautifully, and they're all really comfortable to hold. I also used some really heavy iron glazes. This is a tomato iron red glaze that I think just sparkles in the sun, and I used this on 2 mugs. One of them has sold already, but this one is still available. I loved getting to play with these mugs and splash glaze, and at a time when I was feeling incredibly anxious, this was just the project I needed, and it's been really fun to put it together in a longer form video for you. I hope you enjoyed watching. There's still more mugs that I'm going to show off as we talk, but this isn't something I do a lot of. I make a lot of short form content, so if you liked seeing this, please let me know. I would love to spend more time doing this, but it's very time consuming, and if I'm going to spend my time doing it, I want to make sure that you're enjoying watching it. So please let me know in the comments if you want to see more of this, or which one of these is your favorite. This one right here is my favorite. There's pinks and reds, and it's so juicy is the best word I can use to describe it. I love this little one. It's still available in my shop. All of these went live last weekend as part of my update. These mugs are all on the smaller side, holding between 6 and 12 ounces of liquid, so they're not meant to hold a lot, but they are meant to be super comfortable to hold and have lots of surface texture for you to run your hands on, which is why I call them worry mugs. Hopefully, holding them and using them helps you get through some of the worries in your day, because making them certainly helps me work through my anxieties and worries, and I hope using them helps you through some of yours. You can check out these pots along with a bunch of others on my website if you are interested in them, and thank you so much for watching. It's been so fun making this long form video for you, and if you enjoyed watching it, please let me know in the comments so I know that I should make some more of them. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and thanks again for watching.